So what you're going to be looking for is you're going to be looking for rocks that look a little bit different. I like pointing out different looking rocks. This time you're going to look for rocks that look kind of like sliced bread. And now it's not your first loaf of sliced bread, it's going to be your second loaf. And where you see that sliced bread rock, you're going to see a hole in the rock. And that, of course, is your Bushy Head mine shaft. About 10 o'clock right now. Soon it'll be 9 o'clock for most folks. And then, like I said, the captain's going to spin around so everyone gets a chance to see it.
Wow.
But that's the Bushy Head mine shaft. Like I said, it goes back about 80 feet or so. The far back of that mine shaft, you still see the 1,000 islands or so. And to be able to differentiate what's an island and a rock, just know that little cedar island right there with the cedar tree growing out of it is an island because it has vegetation on top. You see a rock and it doesn't have vegetation on top, it's just a rock.
Just made the cut.
Mm-hmm.
Once more to another bald eagle's nest. If we look off the right hand side at about 1 o'clock right now, this area would have looked quite different. A lot of these islands in the peninsula, kind of clear cut. And multiple times I mentioned about how the water levels here rose from historical levels. And the reason for that is because of these lumber companies who came in. One gentleman in particular owned a sawmill in International Falls. And he wanted an easier way to transport National Falls to Fort Francis. You're driving across the dam there. Now one dam wasn't enough, of course, so they needed to build 2 more. So we have one at Squirrel Falls and at Kettle Falls. Squirrel Falls on the Canadian side, Kettle Falls on the American side. And of course, those both have falls in the name. But now they should have dam in the name because there are dams at both of those locations. So 3 dams total on the lake. Was able to raise the level of the water here about 7 to 10 feet to close to where it is in modern times. Of course, it fluctuates. There's an international committee that still goes and fluctuates the levels of the lakes here. But that was all done so it'd be easier to go ahead and float down those white pines back to the sawmill. Also increasing the level of the lake, it allowed it to freeze over. And so you could actually transport across the ice those white pines. Because industry doesn't stop no matter what time of year it is. And so this inner channel that we're kind of driving along today, this is also the path of what becomes the ice road in wintertime. The lumber company, like I said, they came through and they clear cut this area. So none of the actual forest you're seeing today is over 100 years old. None of that virgin pine. No old growth forest here within Voyager National Park. A little bit south of here, there was a calculating error that caused a really interesting thing to happen where there's about 40 acres that are now known as the Lost 40 of old growth forests. The only old growth forest left in Minnesota. Really interesting. And when I say a calculating error, they used to have maps back in the day that they made of the area, and someone made a map that made a lake look larger than it was. And of course, if you're the lumber company, you're not going to want to buy up land that has a lake on it. You want to buy an area that has forest on it. So that little error geography, was about 40 acres or so of land that never got bought up to be used by the lumber companies. And so those trees there are 100 years ago. Think about the folks who came to this area along these waterways to where the actual namesake of the park comes from, the Voyagers. Voyagers is a French word that means travelers. The travelers we're talking about were part of what's called the fur trade. Now, misconception about the Voyagers is that they were fur trappers. They were not fur trappers, they were the fur traders. Think of them as like the truckers for modern day. They were bringing goods from one area to another. But they would canoe these waters.
Not a bad office.
No. No.
They would canoe these waters. They would actually canoe for about 16 hours a day. They would canoe for about 16 hours a day, about 60 strokes a minute. They would only pause once an hour to smoke their pipes with the Voyagers. It's all part of this fur trade. Now the Voyagers, they would be in a vehicle known as a birch bark canoe. And so those were also adopted from the Native American tribe as well. And they would paddle these waters for a few centuries till those beaver hats went out of style. Now, something interesting that you might not have known is the reason that we have an international border between the U.S. and Canada and where it's located is because of those Voyagers themselves. That trade route that they would take was the reason that we chose the water boundary between the U.S. and Canada. So in 1783, when the U.S. won their war for independence, there was a treaty that was signed that formulated that commonly known trade route as the boundary between the two. And that is why we are going down what's called boundary waters today. Rain, as all that was starting to melt. So we had ice melting, snow melting, and rain coming. So a lot of water flowing in this area, and it wasn't enough to actually flow out. So we had flooding in this area. And evidence of that is all around us, but most specifically, if we look off to our bow here at about 11 o'clock, we can see what we call the bridge to nowhere. This is a dock that eventually ended up in this location, but once was somewhere else. Because as the lake flooded, of course, there was docks that became unattached, floated to other areas. And so one of the industries that was really kind of funny last year was there was a couple men who went around and actually used the rope, almost like they were kind of catching steer, and they were actually capturing those runaway ducks. And so that's one of those naturally occurring things that makes the water level rise. Collect those nets. He collect all that fish, eventually bring it back here, and he put it in his fish processing. But of course he needed to keep that fish fresh, so he needed ice. So that's where the ice house comes in now. The ice house, when I say ice house, of course he's not going to the local store and gathering ice. He's actually getting it from the lake itself. So every other winter, he would actually come up. We've been seeing loons and eagles and ducks and cormorants and all sorts of things on the islands today. We can think back to hair.